Dr. Sarah Pospos. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Of course. Thank you so much, Brad, for having me. Such an honor.
Yeah, pretty exciting messages we've exchanged, especially with your training and your area of work. It seems like the cutting edge of medicine, and that's so exciting because I think we're all trying to reconcile the challenges, the problems, the narrowness of traditional medical treatment. We're into the ancestral health scene, progressive ideas, and things like that. But of course, we have a lot to synchronize here to get optimal care. And so I think I would love for you to introduce yourself and talk about your training and how you kind of ended in this current model of practicing perinatal psychiatry and sports psychiatry, and doing it from this new remote model that allows it to be accessible to more people.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Pospos, as Brad mentioned. I completed my psychiatry residency as a chief resident at UCLA Kern. And I've published quite a bit as well on the subject of burnout and depression at places like UCLA, UCSD, and UC Santa Barbara. As a psychiatrist, I am devoted to helping high performers optimize and balance their lives through exercise, nutrition, sleep, stress management, efficient time management techniques, and other sustainable lifestyle, which is very much in line with my expertise in both perinatal psychiatry and sports psychiatry. So currently, I'm only serving patients by telehealth, which just means that the visits are done virtually, 100% virtually, in California. But for non-California residents, I also do offer free resources on all things lifestyle psychiatry on my website, lifestyletelepsychiatry.com.
So it sounds like your patients are people looking for something different than the traditional model, the often criticized model of going to see a psychiatrist for a very short visit, getting prescribed medication, and then the essential role being just kind of tweaking the medications rather than bringing in all these other aspects that you mentioned about lifestyle, diet, sleep, all the important things that might affect your psychiatric health.
Yes, definitely. So, in addition to like you mentioned, the traditional psychiatric care that we're all perhaps familiar with, I also would like to emphasize the lifestyle factors of things through things like in nutrition, exercise, sleep, optimizing sleep, and all those good stuff. Because as you probably can imagine, in psychiatry, most, if not all of the conditions are chronic, right? So just like we would think of other common chronic conditions like diabetes, for example. Yes, medication might help, but in addition to that, what if someone doesn't take care of their diets, continue to take a lot of highly processed sugary food? What if someone's not physically active? Their insulin hormone that took care of the glucose response in the body wouldn't work as much. What if someone's not sleeping enough or is under constant stress? Their stress hormone, the cortisol, would be through the roof and also affects all this thing in their body in relation to the glucose response. So similarly, like you mentioned, in mental health, just adding these tweaks, lifestyle tweaks, can really improve their mental health as a whole as well.
So what are we missing here with the traditional view of these conditions and treatments? We talk about anxiety, depression at record rates. We had COVID, the quarantine, which disrupted a lot of people, young and old, having to recalibrate and missing out on rich social interactions and things that improve our mental health. But where do these pieces fit together when someone comes in with a clinical diagnosis of anxiety, depression, whatever it is, PTSD? How can we intervene both from the medication side and the lifestyle side? How closely related are those? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So Typically in psychiatry, our first visit is dedicated to get to know you, right? In terms of not only your current symptoms. So, for instance, that would be your depression symptoms, your anxiety symptoms, or what have you, but also your life in general. So, what's your family background, for instance? What's your occupations? How far did you go to school, and things like that, including your lifestyle. So how's your sleep typically look like, your physical activity level in general, your nutrition and whatnot. So all those taken together, these data points, based on that, we can create ideally an holistic, integrative, overlooking plan that not only address your psychiatric symptoms, so that would be the depressive anxiety symptoms at that time, but also attack the symptoms from other viewpoints, including their lifestyles as well, so that we optimize all the mental health outcomes that we're looking for. So that would be your mood, your stress level or anxiety level, your sleep, your energy level, which all ties up together in terms of what you're experiencing in the end.
So you're certainly going to recommend your patient get sufficient sleep, get up with the sun, get some sun exposure, do some physical exercise, which has been proven to work better than SSRIs to combat depression. But what are some of the challenges when people maybe they know what to do, but they're too depressed or anxious to adhere to healthy eating strategies or exercise protocol?
Yes, great question. So I would probably take that into two parts. So as of right now, specifically for depression, perhaps exercise specifically is proven to be as effective as medication or as effective as talk therapy, but not necessarily in replacement of those, if indicated, of course. In psychiatry, we always try to see it on a case-by-case basis in terms of treatment-wise, whether they need medication, whether they need talk therapy, whether they need lifestyle changes approach, or a combination of both, which typically is the most ideal way to go. And then in terms of the second part of it is in terms of if they're in the middle of the depression or in the middle of, feeling down, hopeless, not motivated, which could be very well part of their depressive symptoms, right? It's definitely very hard to introduce an quote unquote added task like exercising, making sure that they get enough sleep and whatnot. So perhaps one or two possible solutions to that is one, just start small. We don't necessarily have to attack all this checklist, so to speak, at the same time. So perhaps just try to improve their sleep first by using, one tip, for instance, avoiding coffee before noon. That might be a start. And then as they go up with that momentum, we could start introducing more stuff. That way it's less overwhelming and they're more likely to get a buy-in on that. The second tip would be, since we're simultaneously going to treat the depression as well, once they're not in the peak of the depression, so once the symptoms start to get better, then we could be in a better place to have that conversation on how to optimize their lives in other aspects as well.
What do you see are the major areas where we are going astray in modern life, with your total client base?
Ooh, that's a good point. I'm glad you bring that up. I think perhaps in terms of lifestyle, in general, it has switched quite a bit, right, from before, especially perhaps with COVID too. So just on top of my head, after COVID, a lot of work has turned to be remote work, which means, for instance, for parents, they have to juggle their home life with their work life simultaneously. Perhaps it's a bit harder to put a separation in terms of being on call, so to speak, for work 24/7 versus before when they have to go into the office. So with that, it comes with lifestyle changes. Perhaps their sleep get affected. because of less work-life balance. Their stress level continues to increase. And because of this busy lifestyle, it's hard to pay attention to get in that exercise, the recommended amount of exercise that's needed, or to eat healthier in terms of their nutrition factor.
And what role does the medication play in the story, and how, what have you seen has been the most successful interventions from that side, assuming that we're also telling the patient to get enough sleep, get sunlight, get exercise?
Mm-hmm. So it's very much a case-by-case basis. Most of it determined, perhaps one important consideration is their symptoms, right? So the more severe the symptom is, perhaps the treatment would be more complicated, and that might include medications. But having said that, I just wanted to emphasize that sometimes only medication is not enough. We probably should also pay attention and highlight the importance of changing these lifestyle habits in addition to medications when indicated to, just to get that more compound effect of both intervention.
And so I wonder if that philosophy has compelled you to depart from your traditional training model, where I don't know what role those play when you're going through psychiatric residency and so forth. Maybe tell me if there is some increased awareness these days to the lifestyle elements, or is this stuff that you have to bring in outside of your medical training and certification?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we, through medical school and medical training, we all learn about the importance of things like exercise, how it affects the brain, how it affects the body, of course, the mind-body connections and whatnot, for example. But having said that, in practice, there's a lot of limitation, perhaps. One, for instance, just the time, right? Sometimes the time is not enough to not only get to know the patients, address the complaints, talk about the intervention or the treatment that we wanted to move forward with, but also to get just in depth in terms of trying to get to know their lifestyle in this case, and counsel them as well in terms of what to do with those lifestyle changes. So I think the knowledge is there. It's just sometimes in practice, it's hard to implement at times because of those restrictions or those limitations.
Yeah, so what compelled you to kind of launch this new model of telepsychiatry, and also include all these other elements into the healing process?
Yes, so perhaps it's the overarching themes that I have. As I mentioned earlier, I'm devoted to helping high performers to help optimize and balance their lives, right? With using this lifestyle sustainable, not only a one-time lifestyle technique adjustments too. So in order to do that, I'm glad you touched on the telepsych component. Most of these high performers have busy lifestyles, right? Time is very, very valuable and limited. So with telepsychiatry, perhaps it could be a solution in terms of at least addressing those valuable time. Instead of having to commute back and forth to your doctor's office and having to wait to be seen in the doctor's office, you could simply just be available for your set appointment time, and instead use those time to do your work, do your errands, do everything else that you might need to do, and save time that way. So the access in terms of convenience could potentially be a solution in this type of group, the high performers group.
Well, you're also being able to seek out the ideal medical guide wherever you live. I mean, California is a big place, and that's probably the best factor, is that these progressive opportunities exist now for 39 million people, or whatever the population is in California.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad you brought that topic up too, because in telepsychiatry, like you said, we just need to be in the specific state. So let's say California, for instance. If you have to travel, back and forth from LA, SF, San Diego, what have you, as long as you're still in California, you can still keep your appointment and not miss it, and not having to go through the hassle of finding a different doctor, starting from scratch, and things along those lines.
Now, how does this work in the traditional insurance provider model? I know we have a lot of cutting edge physicians that are practicing outside the model. And so you're doing cash pay for your stem cell therapy. It's quite expensive. It's limited to people in the high income category, but can we obtain, I mean, do you take insurance from carriers for your practice, or how does that work? And people like you, obviously.
Yes. So currently in my practice, no, we're out of network, meaning we don't take any insurance. It's cash based. So what it means for the patients, at least, are three things. One, it's personalized care. And what I mean by that is, as you probably all know, sometimes insurance poses certain restrictions that may or may not, in fact, direct patient care, right? So just as an example, some insurance wouldn't allow the psychiatrist, the doctor, to do things like additional things like talk therapy, addressing this lifestyle, and recommending lifestyle intervention in addition of the regular prescribing medication practice. Some insurance might not cover certain medications that could be a better fit for a patient. And because of the amounts of paperwork that are needed back and forth by the insurance, those time that is dedicated for direct patient care might be diverted into doing paperwork and whatnot. The second benefit, perhaps, is getting a more confidential care, and by that I mean as long as you're with an insurance, of course, your medical records permanently become parts of associated with that insurance. So when the time comes to apply for, let's say, life insurance, disability insurance, and what have you, it may or may not affect your eligibility to apply for those. And then the third point is in terms of telepsychiatry or telemedicine setting that we already talked about earlier. Some insurance may or may not reimburse or pay for that. So just give much freedom and option in terms of how we want the psychiatric care to be when you're considering cash-based or out-of-network psychiatric practice.
So we're getting the freedom, the flexibility, the more personalized relationship. And do you see us heading in that direction smoothly in the years to come? Or is this going to be a big challenge to kind of topple the traditional model where you're into a very more regimented system with limited options, less time with the physician one-on-one, and all those other less privacy sort of thing?
I believe so. Before COVID, some had already started telepsychiatry or telemedicine visits. And of course, a lot of places had already been out of network with insurance as well. But since COVID, as you probably can imagine, we all just have to scramble, right? The in-person healthcare settings just all have to scramble into telemedicine, at least for that part amount of time. So yes, I definitely see this heading towards that direction in the future.
Right, the insurance carriers are going to have to look to these solutions, especially because they are more economical in many ways. We don't have a giant fancy office on the 11th floor for Dr. Sarah because we don't need it, and you don't need it. And so it does seem more efficient, but it seems like we have some hurdles to cross over because there's so much paperwork and all that nonsense that we're subjected to in the traditional care model.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So you've published a lot on burnout, anxiety, depression, and I'm wondering some of that research and commentary. Are you touting the success of diet, nutrition, sleep, stress management in conjunction with medication, or what's some of that? What are some of the high points that you've discovered through your research and publishing?
Yes, great question. So I did allude to some of the lifestyle approaches, mainly yoga and meditation within that research, not so much in depth of the other aspect yet, because at that time I was focusing, solely on burnout and depression and those side of things in a more traditional approach, so to speak. But as you mentioned, there's definitely strong connection with lifestyle changes and common psychiatric conditions that we came across, including depression, anxiety, even extending to substance use, ADHD, and all the other common conditions in psychiatry as well.
So where does yoga and meditation fit? What kind of results have you seen for what conditions and so forth?
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of exercise, specifically, the most well-researched type, if you will, is actually aerobics, but yoga and meditation does definitely have benefits, as you can imagine, in depression, anxiety, and other common illnesses. And the reason for that is several fold. So first, as you know, yoga has many components, right? There's the adopting a certain posture component. There's a breathing component. There's also mindfulness that's often incorporated into yoga practice as well. So each of these have different specific roles, but in general, to quote unquote oversimplify it, it affects not only the mind, but also the body. For instance, for one, it stimulates what we call BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, called a miracle grow for your brain, if you will, which just stimulates the new nerve cells in the brain to come up and also improve their connection, their functions, and also just kind of their connectivity to one another in a long-term basis. And then secondly, perhaps this is a bit more familiar with others too, it, instead of activating our fight and flight response, which is associated with what we call quote unquote sympathetic response, it activates the opposite, which is parasympathetic response. And that's the system that lower your heart rate, lower your breathing rate when you're feeling anxious, activates the part of your brain that enables you to think clearly instead of just living in fear and trying to escape the situations, for example, and many other benefits that comes with yoga and meditation as well.
Yeah, I love that insight about boosting your brain neuron function, brain-derived neurotrophic factor coming from movement activity. One of the most prominent studies from UCLA. Hey, So I believe it was groups of elderly where one group walked fewer than 4,000 steps per day. So that's kind of trending toward that sedentary lifestyle. And then the other group walked significantly more than that. And they had larger, better functioning brains into their old age, basically bringing the takeaway insight that humans are meant to move, and we need that everyday activity to connect directly with improved brain function.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the most interesting part as well, specifically in mental health, a research mentioned just 1 hour per week for aerobic exercise can help protect you against depression. And just one bout of exercise, so one episode of exercise, does appear to decrease your anxiety level as well.
A single workout can go and
just a single
blow off some
workout.
steam, some energy. So what's going on at the, the biological level there? The anxiety is sort of I'm guessing like, an overactive brain or something where engaging in exertion will turn off this this faucet, or what's going on?
Yeah, so perhaps it's helpful to look back a bit, right? So anxiety in our ancestors' world back then, one of its function is to let us know about threat to our survival. So for instance, in the hunting world, if a bear were to come and attack us, our anxiety try to tell our brain that, hey, there's a threat to our survival in that way. And the brain, in reaction to that, turns on all the other body responses, which might include increasing your heart rate, kind of increasing your alertness, so to speak, increasing your breathing rate and whatnot, the fight or flight or sympathetic response. So how exercise might help? A lot of ways. One is the BDNF factors of things, which just improves your brain function. Two, it activates it activates the part of your brain that think more clearly versus the quote unquote ones associated with your fear. But perhaps specifically for anxiety, an interesting part is um, in case of anxiety or panic attacks, if you're so used to it, your brain might perceive bodily sensations that could be similar in panic attacks and exercising. And what I mean by that are those responses like high heart rate, higher heart rate, higher breathing rate, and whatnot, and interpreted as a sign of anxiety. So when you exercise, you expose your body and mind to this similar set of symptoms, but in a controlled, positive way. So down the road, your body wouldn't automatically think of this set of responses as anxiety, but is more used to that and can be less anxious, if that makes sense, whenever these physical sensations come about.
Oh, that's great. I've never quite heard it described that way, but it's I guess, you know, I've heard of exposure therapy too, where you have anxiety about talking to people. And so Dr. Craig Marker, a former guest on the show, psychologist in Atlanta, he takes patients to the supermarket parking lot front entrance where the solicitors are, you know, looking for money or whatever. And he just has them greet people and say hi. And so they're exposed to their biggest fear. And I suppose like going out and doing a workout when you're when you're experiencing high anxiety, you're now simulating with the heart rate, with the cortisol, with all these things. And then I suppose, especially when you complete the workout and return to a rested state, now you're telling your brain, your emotions that you can handle it. It's okay. The workout's over. And that's a proxy for the anxiety being over. Is that a relevant insight?
Yes, exactly. It's like exactly like you said. It's pretty much exposure, quote unquote, but the key is it's a systematic, right? Exposure. We wouldn't, just have, in this case, have someone do it from a scale of 0 to 100. We wouldn't just have them do 100 immediately, but it's systematic, and then it's associated with a positive controlled environments, of course. And it's similar to that analogy, definitely.
Unless, you know, you go out for a jog and a bear or a pit bull actually does chase you, then it's going to be an ineffective anxiety treatment to go for a workout. We're expecting a pleasant workout where you're on a nice trail and waving hi to other joggers or whatever controlled setting we're talking about, the Peloton bike in the comfort of your living room, no honking horns, no exhaust blowing at you or buses cutting you off. I got it. Okay, great. I've also
Exactly.
read that a immersion into cold water, which is something I'm a fan of. This cold water immersion represents an instant cure for anxiety as well. I'm wondering if you've heard that, or if that's the same mechanism that a strenuous or a vigorous workout would offer.
Good point. I am actually not familiar with that, but I'll be sure to check that out. In terms of cold water.
Yeah,
Could
the
very
cold
much be.
thermogenesis, like the therapeutic cold exposure to prompt. I mean, obviously it prompts a fight or flight reaction when you jump into cold water, but then as soon as you get out, then you have that recalibration. I'm thinking of a recent guest on the show, Dr. Anna Lemke, author of Dopamine Nation, where she talks about this concept of opponent process reaction, where if you put yourself through something difficult and challenging, you are getting like sort of a rebound effect in the brain toward sensations of pleasure, calmness, and all these things. So when we're going and doing a vigorous workout, we're looking at that rebound effect where we have that sensation of calmness, as opposed to maybe, pre-workout state of anxiety because we've been sitting around worrying about our problems and stressing over the future.
Right, definitely. That would make perfect sense. And also to touch on that as well, I'm glad you brought that up, because exercise not only have, of course, the biological quote unquote benefit, right, but also psychological side of things too. And that could include a sense of mastery. So whenever, let's say someone completed one session and then the next day completed another session and so forth, it just builds on their sense of mastery, which would, of course, impact their self-confidence, self-esteem, and all the other good stuff as a whole as well.
So would other things fall into this category, like doing an art project, making a drawing, making a clay formation in the studio, or something where you're expressing artistic energy and trying to gain form of mastery? I wouldn't call it mastery, but I do these clay dogs that are pretty good, but they're not perfect. So I feel like I'm building a semi-mastery and getting a completely different experience than a physical workout. But I'm also wondering if there's, I mean, you mentioned yoga and meditation, which are, quite different than the lifting the weights or running down the street.
Right, absolutely. I believe so. So, anytime we put in time or energy towards one goal, in this case, the art part, right? We could just build on those momentum in terms of trying to build our sense of mastery, or in relation to self-esteem, self-confidence in our ability to problem solve ourselves, and things along those lines too.
So I guess it's really getting out of your getting out of your head, getting out of your inactive state. I would assume anxiety and depression are strongly associated with inactivity, rather than the rash of bicycle riders who experience depression while they're pedaling up a hill. I don't think that exists as much. I never thought about that either, where if you can just get moving in some way and get into some project, you're going to be in pursuit of self-confidence, mastery, and an ensuing improvement in your symptoms.
Yes, and perhaps another aspect to add is the social aspect too, right? Because with exercise, arts, or other similar projects, you also add that social stimulation to the brain too, which not only helps prevent withdrawal, which is or isolation, which is very common in depression, let's say, but also get more input in terms of stimulation to your brain, which goes a long way too.
Dr. Sarah, we haven't talked much about drugs yet. I mean, come on, everyone's excited to talk to the psychiatrist. I'm wondering, it is really refreshing and wonderful that you're leading with all these other concepts, but I'm wondering, what are the role that these play? Do you feel like they're overused, overprescribed, as we often hear about, used as a crutch? What does a winning formula look like in the event that, and I want you to talk about athletes too, because sometimes athletes need prescriptions, or they're real people. We just saw the great Noah Lyles break the American record last night in the 200 meters at the World Championships, and he's been public about his challenges with battling depression and so forth. Not sure if he mentioned medication as part of his battles, but you would assume so if he's been public about it and been under treatment. So where do all these pieces fit in? And I think I'm really looking for, like, what are the best use of these amazing breakthroughs that we have in pharmaceutical medicine today?
Yeah, that's a very loaded question, right? Right.
Woo, loaded.
So in psychiatry, perhaps just to give a background, like I mentioned, typically when we first see a patient, we did this thorough evaluation, right, on getting to know them and their symptoms, everything about their symptoms and their lifestyle that could contribute to what's happening to them right now.
Now,
Based on
Sarah,
that,
does that happen in traditional framework? So if you're taking your first visit to the psychiatrist at an HMO or a major provider, mainstream, are you going to have that sit down where they're going to get to know you and see if your mother-in-law is really annoying you, or those kind of things?
Wow, that's a very good question. I would say yes, every psychiatrist would try to, but again, time is, of course, the session in terms of time is of sometimes could be a limiting factor in terms of how depth can you go in just those per session, right? That's why, especially in psychiatrists, I think it's important to keep your follow-up if you can with the same doctor, because it's like piecing different pieces of the puzzle together, and along times you could just get to know each other more and more that way. But after this what we call psychiatric evaluation, so the interview part, then we together would determine what kind of conditions do you have. Of course, again, it's a case by case basis. So based on this information, we'll determine, for example, if you have depression, if you have anxiety, if you have both, if you have other conditions. And based on that, and the severity of the symptoms for the most part, then we can discuss more about treatment. So in psychiatry, treatment could consist a lot of things. There's, of course, the options of talk therapy, especially if your symptoms are on the milder side. So that includes things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other types of therapy. If your symptoms is more on the severe side, on a more serious side, we might also utilize medication depending on your condition. So for example, for depression, we'll use antidepressant. For anxiety, we'll use anti-anxiety and so forth. Or we could, if you're open to it, we could, and it's indicated, we could do combination of both. Lifestyle, ideally, the lifestyle part of it, lifestyle counseling would always help, no matter which way we choose, whether it's medication, whether it's talk therapy, whether it's combination, because again, it's just a sustainable investment in your health, both physical and mentally, with that regards. In terms of athletes, those sports related psych medications, I would say it just have a lot of more subtle nuances for several reasons. One, perhaps an athlete would have some consideration in taking certain medications because that medications might inadvertently affect their performance. So it could go either way. If the medication happened to improve their athletic performance, let's say it helped reduce tremor, like in the case of propranolol, it might be prohibited in certain sports, right? That where fine movement is of importance, like archery, shooting, things like that. And so, of course, an athlete wouldn't want to be taking a medication that would lead them into trouble unknowingly in that scenario. Or a medication might have side effects that, on the other hand, impair their performance. So let's say medications that cause weight gain, that lowers your heart rate, it might affect sports, endurance-related sports, for instance, and therefore might impair your athletic performance. So that's why I think perhaps it's a better fit if you're an athlete and is concerned about that to get in touch with sports psychiatrists, because those specific medication concerns can be addressed in more depth.
Now, are you using talk therapy as one of your tools, your protocol, or are you referring that out?
Great question. So in terms of the traditional full session of talk therapy, I refer it out, but I do try to use some components, if and when is necessary, of talk therapy within my visit.
This is super cutting edge. It's amazing stuff, and I suppose you're still going through these traditional protocols of how to treat a patient, and you're applying a diagnosis to them. And I'm curious about that whole world of diagnosing mental health conditions and what this continuum represents from someone who has a label, such as you have anxiety, you have PTSD, you are bipolar, you are depressed, and then at what point can we switch over to a model or a belief system where you are exhibiting symptoms of depression, which you can alleviate immediately with a walk around the block, even going to more extreme, like bipolar is believed to be a pretty hardcore diagnosis. But Amber O'Hearn, a leader in the carnivore diet space, has talked publicly about being virtually free of symptoms and free of medication after having, a very serious condition of bipolar for a long time. Through she points to dietary intervention as her main way of essentially curing herself from this illness by virtue of not having any symptoms nor medication.
Yeah, I think definitely the first step I would say would be to recognize the symptoms, meaning, let's say depression, for example. Everyone feels down sometimes, right? Whenever something in our life happen, sometimes we feel sad, we feel blue, and whatnot. But when exactly does it considered quote unquote depression? So typically, in terms of when to seek psychiatric help, first let me back up. In terms of depression, perhaps, like you said, it's a spectrum. No one has the exact same symptoms, in comparison, like A to B would be exactly the same. But some common symptoms to watch out for might be feeling down for most of the days, not enjoying things that you like to enjoy before, your hobbies, for instance, having trouble concentrating, sleeping, eating, feeling hopeless a lot of times, beating yourself up over some mistakes, to feel excessively guilty about something, for instance, and things along those lines. And especially when these symptoms have caused intense, severe distress, or if they interfere in your day-to-day. So that could look like it might affect your work, your relationship, your grades if you're a student, then it's a good time to seek psychiatric help.
So let's say that you meet this criteria where you're not depressed for an hour after a disappointing phone call, but it's really dragging you down and it's becoming a pattern and it's interfering with everyday life activities. So a diagnosis is applied and you're suffering from depression. I'm wondering, at what point are these similar to your diagnosis of cancer of the throat versus something that's a symptom, and the cause is these 7 things that you can correct immediately. One of them being, in the case of anxiety, you go and conduct a workout and you no longer are representing symptoms of anxiety, and we can build from there into just these are behaviors or present circumstances that don't represent a label on the person.
Great question. So perhaps the best way to differentiate it is to see a psychiatrist. Why? Because those would be things that we consider during our psychiatric interview, that first interview. Because like you said, it could be a lot of things, right? Depression could, for one, is multifactorial. There could be many causes. We could also consider things like, currently, is there any specific stressors in your life that might quote unquote trigger that depression, or make yourself sad, in this case, like the phone call. We might also consider more information like your history. Has this ever happened in the past? If so, how long has that been? What other symptoms did you experience then? We might also consider your family history, if there's depression in the family, or your medical history, because some medical conditions might look like depression. Let's say low thyroid hormone, or low iron, anemia, which may be manifested as feeling tired all the time, for instance. So it's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that needs to be puzzled together, that need to be pieced together. And then in terms of intervention, which would be the next step of that, again, it just depends on your particular situation. So it's an individual basis, so to speak, depending on the severity of the symptoms, your other medical conditions, if applies, your current life stressors, and things along those lines are very important too.
So today, with the accelerating pace of technology and the exponential increase in technology, meaning that in the last 1 year, technology has advanced more than the previous 10 years combined in many ways, which has advanced more than the previous 100 years. So we're having to navigate and negotiate these extreme changes in our lifestyles. I'm old enough to reference a good chunk of my life where I existed before the internet, before mobile devices and all these things. So I have reference points of when, we'd sit around on the porch and talk to burn a few hours of time, where that doesn't happen anymore because we're all connected to devices and so forth. So, I've had to navigate these challenges personally, even in my career. For example, working on writing a book. And in the old days, that would mean going to the library, checking out 4 or 5 hardcover books, bringing them home, thumbing through them, bookmarking, taking handwritten notes, trying to work on a manuscript. And now you're just cranking with 11 browser windows open, getting all the information you need at your fingertips, and proceeding at a breakneck speed to crank out more and more content. And then, of course, we're consuming more and more content than ever before. So this, it seems to have a overall detrimental effect on mental health, because it's so difficult to adjust and navigate, although there are many positive aspects to it. And so I want to frame the conversation, not coming out and saying social media is terrible, so are mobile devices, because they're pretty awesome in so many ways. But I think it's a matter of taking control of the situation, using them to our advantage, using them to give us the life that we're dreaming about, and the pleasure and the enjoyment and the satisfaction, and none of the negative stuff. So in your practice and in your observation, what are some of the things that are tripping us up here with technology relating to burnout, and how are some of the ways that we can navigate this successfully and make them positives?
100%. That's such an important point to discuss, I believe. So just a couple of things right off the bat, in terms of notifications, whether it's email notifications, social media notifications, news in general that pops up in our phone. It could very much be anxiety provoking, right? Like you said, we're continued to live in that space where nothing stops. Literally, we're bombarded with information. And sometimes if it's on the news, it might not be the best information in terms of quote unquote happy information, right? It might be disturbing information, so to speak. So that could very much impact our just mental space in general. And this notifications also is very much anxiety provoking, in a sense that, like you said, we're not in full control of our time, if I could put it that way. Let's say, we're trying to focus on work, but we keep our notification open and things keeps popping up. We might feel this needs to respond immediately, for example, or, just having that in the back of our mind, just adding clutters, if you will, to our brain in that way. And then the other thing, the second thing is also the comparison side of things, especially with social media. It's very hard to not intentionally or unintentionally compare yourself to what's going on out there, what other people are doing, their achievements, their lifestyle, whatever's going on in their life. So the comparison piece is definitely huge. It could very much lead to not only burnout, perhaps, in a sense that you're having to quote unquote compete all the time, but also might lead to what we call imposter syndrome. For those of you who's not familiar with the term, it typically happens to high achievers when they have this almost selective attention, where they attributed all their success, even though there's a lot, to luck, to things like luck, help from others, just anything outside themselves. But whenever they hit a wall, they attributed it to the fact, quote unquote fact, that they're not competent, they're not good enough. So that could very much be triggered by this comparison as well.
So the symptoms of imposter syndrome are going out of your way to diffuse a credit or credit for your accomplishments, effusive in your gratitude and pointing to luck and so forth is one. And then the other one is when you struggle, you internalize it that the reason you're struggling is because you don't deserve to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you hear that term bantered about all the time, but I never really reflected deeply on the definition. Now, where does this sort of thing originate from as a prominent condition these days, when you went through a heck of a lot of training to become a psychiatrist. So you went through years and years of medical school residency. You probably have a memory of those hard times and all the hard work that you put in. How could you possibly develop something like imposter syndrome when you have all this graphic recognition that you worked hard to get where you are?
Very, very insightful question. Very good question. So I think it probably, or one of the more common cause, if I may put it that way, is what we in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, called a cognitive distortion, right? Which just means our minds sometimes are put in automatic pattern of thinking something that simply is not true. So in this case, the mind selectively attributed things to different things. I don't know if that makes sense. The mind has selective attention. So anything that's good, your mind just makes you believe that it's not because of yours. So even though you achieve a lot of things, it's just because of luck. It's just because of other people's help, because your mind makes you believe that you're not good enough as an overarching team. So they can diffuse, they can almost selectively differentiate what happens to you, bad or good, based on that overarching or core thoughts, core automatic thoughts.
So why would the human brain engage in this? Is it some sort of protective mechanism to protect against a sense of devastating failure if you do struggle in your career or don't get hired by your desired job or something?
Great question. So many believe that this sort of automatic core thinking pattern originate from childhood, right? In terms of just in our lives, it has a long root, so to speak, going back to our childhood, because sometimes we just need to survive. We just need to do certain things, or in this way, think a certain ways to help us get there. And then unknowingly, we keep using this thinking pattern again and again and again throughout our adulthood, and it just becomes ingrained. Although most of the time we didn't realize that it's there in our brain.
Oh, I can see an athletic relevance here, where at some point you are overmatched and intimidated when you walk out to practice for the first day for the UCLA football team, and you're a walk-on thinking, wow, these guys are big and strong and fast, and I don't really deserve to be here, so I better work my ass off and hustle more than anyone else on the field so I don't get blown out the side door, never to return. And so you have this battling mentality, rather than stroking your own ego and coming in with too much swagger and getting it handed to you. You by necessity have that humbleness. But then when the humbleness is gone overboard years later or whatever, I think the actors and the fragile ego that that they seem to have, and that we get to read about in the gossip magazines, where that you're only as good or bad as your last movie, and so the insecurity is rampant, and that can be what was once a powerful weapon, where you were going to apply that determination and not take anything for granted. At a certain point, we have to, I guess, strike a balance to be able to pat ourselves on the back at times and say, yes, I am a world's leading authority on telepsychiatry, and I'd love to talk about it,
Right, absolutely, 100%. Like you said, Brad, I think it's all about balance, right? Everything in life, I would say, is a spectrum, and the key, I guess, is to find that balance right in the middle.
Now, what do we do with, I mean, this is, I'm sure, a defined category of mental health, where we have people on the other end of the spectrum, especially in this comparison, instant gratification, social media driven culture, where we have the little superstars. If we're thinking of the youth that are growing up with helicopter and lawnmower parents telling them that they're God's gift and they are going to go be president because of course it's possible and anything you dream, and then they don't get accepted into the 4 preferred colleges, and so they're, and then all the way into adult life, where you hear that term narcissist bandied about all the time, especially in the dating scene and people in the workplace where they think they're God's gift and that their voice reigns over everything else. How do we navigate those waters where I guess that would be the opposite of imposter syndrome is the narcissistic syndrome?
Right, right. And that's why I think, especially for kids, it's important to try to implement the growth mindset or focusing in the process for them, right? So not the outcomes. What I mean by that is, for example, instead of praising the kids on, oh, hey, you're so smart, you got an A, or hey, you're so strong, you make it to the team within your first tryout, but perhaps try to emphasize the fact that they're not resilient, they're working really hard towards their goal, they're not giving up given the first obstacle, and things along those lines. So that way they're more focused, one, on the process, and two, they didn't necessarily or fully relate their self-identity with just their achievement down the road.
Well said. I think you're honoring the work of Carol Dweck, author of Mindset,
Yes.
Stanford, so popular. I'm thinking of my very favorite parenting article called The Inverse Power of Praise, How Not to Talk to Your Kids. We'll have a link for that in the show notes, but it talks about what you just expressed here, where we want to put the emphasis on their effort, on the process, on personal growth, rather than jump over to comparison, measuring and judging, and you're the best and all that kind of thing. And boy, that's something you see left and right all over the place, is forgetting about the process and just trying to obsess with the results and the status and the consumption and all the things that go with it. I had a great talk with Ashley Merriman a long time ago on the podcast, co-author of Nurture Shock and Top Dog. And she talks about, we've often been told to focus on the effort, don't attach your self-esteem to the outcome. And she wanted to offer up a little a nuance or another level of sophistication there. And what we want to do is emphasize the effort toward improvement. So if you're just pounding your head against the wall and making the effort and getting congratulated for that, that could easily lead you off track and you're doing stupid shit with your life. So if you're not destined to be an Ivy League student and you're trying to make more effort to bring yourself up from a C average to a B minus, it's not going to happen for you. Same in the athletic world, where the poor kid who doesn't make the basketball team is now told to go put in more and more and more effort, where maybe they want to, cut their ties with something that's not their destiny, reframe their goal to something more realistic, and then be darn sure that any effort that you put into any peak performance endeavor is appropriate, well-chosen, well-guided, so that you can reference improvement. And so when your kid goes and works on their vocabulary words for an hour and comes out expecting a lollipop and a trip to the ice cream store for putting in all that hard work, let's make sure they weren't goofing around with a video game playing in the background and the effort didn't really count for something. And I love that nuance that Ashley offered up. But again, the emphasis is on the effort and on personal improvement, rather than comparison culture and I guess leading toward imposter syndrome someday if you are obsessed with results only.
Yes, absolutely. That's such a great point. Definitely. And to your point as well, the strong tie to that identity, right? For example, the identity of a quote unquote high achiever, or the athletic identity, the smart student identity. If you're so attached to it instead of the process, so to speak, it could very much be a risk factor of getting imposter syndrome in that relationship.
And depression, anxiety, I suppose.
Absolutely, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So, Dr. Sarah, how do you do it? You have two kids under 2. You're getting this thriving practice going. What are some of your tactics and strategies for keeping a healthy, happy, balanced life, the balancing your career endeavors with your personal life and so forth?
Yes. So it's a work in progress, right? So I try, at least for myself, first always try to reflect on my own why, meaning my personal why am I doing all this, right? My own pros and cons that I already brainstorm myself to come into an informed decision of choosing to pursue all this. And why is that important? I think because if we're just simply listening or looking up to others people's why, not ourselves, we're humans. It's very easy to get ups and downs throughout life. So when the downs come, if we don't have a strong personal sense of why we're doing things in relation to what we want, not what everybody else's want, it gets very hard. Two, on a more practical level, I try to quote unquote multitask. And why I put the quotes on that is because I believe if we're doing something that's requires brain power, it's good to single-handedly focus on that task. But we could always combine it with quote unquote mindless tasks, like doing dishes, for example, doing errands, driving, what have you. So I try to put in my exercise whenever I can while I work, for example. Just get a little stepper from Amazon, a little floor desk that I put on top of my desk to help prop it up to the point where I can stand and type. And then that way I could not only save time in terms of doing valuable work, but also get my steps in, get my cardios in for the day. And then I try to implement simple stress management techniques. For example, one of my favorite, because it's so easy and can be done everywhere, including in a meeting room, is deep breathing. A lot of you probably are familiar with this. With me, deep breathing ideally would include belly breathing, diaphragm breathing, and I also count while doing deep breathing. So I count to 6 when inhaling, 6 when pausing, 6 when exhaling. Do it a couple of times, and that way it could just activate my parasympathetic system to take over the sympathetic, the fight or flight response, and enable me to think more clearly throughout the day. Those would be a few practical tips that I personally use.
Right. So the breathing is, I think, instant access to changing your blood chemistry and your autonomic nervous system state. Why is that so effective? What kind of mechanism is working there?
That's a good question. I think mostly it relates to the parasympathetic nervous system that take control of so many of our body responses associated with anxiety, one, and two, associated with the part of our brain, the earlier part or the reptile, quote unquote, side part of our brain that took over, right? So when that part of the brain took over, our higher functioning brain, the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is responsible for clear thinking, for executive functioning and whatnot, kind of take a back seat. So in order to switch that over, we need to activate those parasympathetic system as a whole, which can be done easily by deep breathing.
Love it. Inhale for 6, hold it for 6, exhale for 6, and you're instantly calm. Dr. Sarah Pospos, we love this quick look at the future of medicine. We can follow you at Lifestyle Telepsychiatry on Instagram, and your website is also lifestyletelepsychiatry.com. Any other ways we can connect with you? Those are the best things to do.
Yes. And again, if you want to get in touch, if you're in California, my next available appointment by telehealth is in September. Or if you're not in California, I also do offer free resources, which you can get at my website, lifestyletelepsychiatry.com/subscribe.
Right on. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. Thanks for listening, everybody. Da, 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 da.